All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the City of Santa Barbara Planning Commission hearing, May 21st, 2020. I'd like to ask Ms. Rydell to call the roll, please. And I'm going to go offline, have the other commissioners come online.
Thank you, Chair Schwartz. This is Heidi Rydell. I'll begin the roll call now. Chair Schwartz.
Here.
Vice Chair Wiscombe.
Here.
Commissioner Bonderson.
Here.
Commissioner Escobedo.
Here.
Commissioner Higgins.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge.
Here.
Commissioner Reed.
Here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Rydell. Before we proceed into our agenda, I would like staff to assist the public in once again understanding how to communicate with us. Of course, there is television coverage through the standard means, but we also have electronic participation available. So if I could ask staff to please upload that screenshot that we have provided in previous hearings and to describe for the public how they can engage with us today. I would appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, Chair Schwartz. This is Ellen Kokinda. If those who are joining the webinar would like to participate or add their public comments, they would need to use the hand icon on their GoToWebinar control panel. And as soon as they click that, it indicates to me that I know that you wish to speak. And I would go ahead and call your name. And then as soon as you unmute yourself, you would have your 2 minutes to speak. And we have a handy timer as well to show when your time is up. And then I can move on to the next speaker. So we will have this slide up every time we have public comments. So there's a helpful visual. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kokinda. Prior to moving on to our preliminary matters, I'm going to make some opening remarks because we have a very full remainder of 2020 ahead of us. So setting that stage, as we look ahead to the remaining months of this year, significant policy and project hearings will be in store for our Planning Commission. And so with this in mind, I've been reflecting on a recent statement that I heard from the Commanding General and Chief of Engineers of the Army Corps of Engineers, whose team redesigned the 500,000 square foot Javits Convention Center in New York City. And as you all may know, that center was selected for emergency adaptive reuse as a COVID-19 medical facility. And this Commanding General stated that it was critical to, quote, design a simple solution to a complicated problem, and a perfect solution was not an option. I say this because as our Planning Commission in 2020 has an imperative, which is to apply discipline in our focus and to tap our deep, diverse bench of knowledge to ensure that we avoid engaging in protracted, overly complex processes and practices so that we can move nimbly to do this same thing, design simple solutions to complicated problems where perfect solutions are not options. And I believe this will do three things. One, it will require superior public hearing preparation by us, and that will also include mutually cooperative coordination with staff. It will also require in-depth yet efficient public hearing facilitation, which I am committed to providing, and it will also foster greater understanding by the general public of city processes and bring forward community-based solutions. The Planning Commission will render decisions that are both Santa Barbara values-based and forward-looking, because our commission is the primary decision-making body that guides, quote, the physical development of the city, and that is stated in our city charter. So to conclude, I am confident that all 7 commissioners are up for this unprecedented calling. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to preliminary matters. If that's Ms. DeBus, do we have any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items?
Madam Chair, we have none.
All right. How about any announcements and appeals?
There are no announcements or appeals.
Okay. Now we can turn to any public comment. Do we have anyone in queue from the public who would like to speak to us on items not on our agenda today?
And
I'll
again,
turn
I
to
would thank
Ms.
you.
Kokinda.
Chair Schwartz, I just would ask if you are a member of the public and you'd like to comment at this time to please raise your hand using the hand icon and I will call on you. And I do not see anyone who has raised their hand at this time. So I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Kokinda. And again, as I have said in our prior hearings where we've been in virtual meeting mode, I want to give the public every opportunity to engage with us. And the technology vehicles are still a bit awkward. And so I'm pausing to allow members of the public to become more comfortable and come on in and connect with us, perhaps in ways and at times when maybe we don't ordinarily allow. So Ms. Kokinda, just keep me posted if you would, if any other members of the public would like to speak with us. Now we can turn, thank you so much. Now we can turn to our new item, and that's an update to city traffic analysis provisions. And as we have, I believe, Mr. Dayton from Transportation Planning making the presentation, I know that we also have Jessica Grant from Transportation Planning available for questions and discussion also. So Mr. Dayton, as you're bringing your webcam up and poised to make a presentation, I would like to share with the rest of the commission that you and I have had the opportunity to prep for today, discussing not only the specifics that are before us that flow from compliance with Senate Bill 743, but as you and I agreed, we also have a broader opportunity today, both with three of 7 new commissioners and not having really discussed traffic analysis and traffic impacts for many months, actually. And so today is an opportunity to ground and reground our full commission. And so I appreciate all the time that you and Ms. Grant are going to spend with us. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Mr. Dayton.
Thank you, Chair Schwartz. It is quite a pleasure to be before the Planning Commission this afternoon. It's been some time, and I don't get in front of you guys enough. I'd love to be spending more time talking about all the things we're doing in transportation planning, and maybe there's some appropriate time to do more of that. I was just thinking of that as I was preparing this presentation. I want to really especially thank Jessica Grant for all the work that she put into this. And then also there's a full court press to get all this stuff done in time for the July 1st deadline we'll be talking about, which is a state deadline. And people in planning and all the people that helped out on this, it's just really great to have the team come together and get this done, because we were bumping up against the deadline, even though we've known for a number of years now that SB 743 has started. So let me go through what I'm going to talk to you about. We'll go for the next slide. And I just want to give you an outline of exactly what we're going to be talking about. You know, the occasion for today, why are we here? And it's this Senate Bill 743 approved a number of years ago, but now through the State Office of Planning and Research is being put forth now is the deadline for all cities in the state of California to comply by July 1. So that is our target date. Talking about the traffic management strategy that we have in Santa Barbara. I want to talk to you a little bit about the history, and then specifically the Planning Commission is going to be updating that strategy. That is going to be the recommended action to the council. So we want to focus on that a little bit and what is recommended. Then we have traffic analysis guidelines, which we've had since around 2012, 2011, but we haven't formalized them with a resolution, and we want to do that. And then finally, adding VMT, vehicles mile traveled, to CEQA, to the State Environmental Act. How does that fit, and what does that look like? And we had a couple commissioners ask those questions, and I'm hoping to answer them in this presentation. Next slide. First of all, why are we here? We talked about that legislation that's going forward. The legislation, I'm going to say this a number of times during the presentation. The legislation, what it does is it ends traffic congestion measurement from a level of service standpoint at intersections, and then introduces a new way of measuring transportation impacts under CEQA, which is through the use of vehicle miles traveled. The legislative, easy for me to say, intent of this is really interesting. What was happening in the state of California is not a lot of infill development. And when you think about, as a planner, you think about the way cities, they build out, and they keep getting out from the center because the land is cheaper to build out. And then the more we build freeways or even transit lines to the outskirts, commuter lines, people can live further and further away from the city center. And of course, as you know, the environmental movement, in particular with greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, which greenhouse gas emissions contribute significantly to that climate change. The goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the further people drive, the more that they pollute, and the more greenhouse gas emissions we get. So two things are at play. One is there's not a lot of development going in the city centers because traffic congestion standards prohibit it. In other words, when a developer proposes something in the middle of a traffic congested area, which the center of town is the most traffic congested areas in the state, the city is saying, no, well, you don't meet our traffic standards, so the development doesn't go in the right location. And then conversely, that development goes further away, which people have to drive to and from work further distances, which increases greenhouse gas emissions through vehicle miles traveled. So the legislative intent is to flip that on its head, is to say, hey, we don't want people driving further away from the city center. We want you to do infill development downtown. We want to see that development in the center of town. And so we're going to take off the governor. You can't say that traffic congestion is an environmental impact anymore. And then we're going to get you on the other side, and we're going to say, hey, and we don't want anything your city does to increase the length of trips into your city is now a significant impact under CEQA. That is the legislative intent. Next slide. Traffic management in the city has a long history. This slide is Upper State Street. This picture here is Upper State Street in the 70s. This comes from the cover of, or actually not the cover, it's on one of the pages of what Commissioner Lodge will tell you was a very important study for Santa Barbara impacts to growth. And we've been concerned about congestion. And you can see on Upper State Street, that street is more congested than it is today. Remarkably so, and I'll tell you that story. So we want to know, what is the history? I think it's really important. Chair Schwartz really wanted me to give a robust feel for the history of congestion and why we would be at such a time where we still care about that. So, and then I want to talk to you about the traffic management strategy, which showed up with the general plan of the growth management ordinance in 2011 with Plan Santa Barbara and the general plan update. And then want to talk about what are you doing with your actions and proposing updates to that traffic management strategy. Next slide. This is 1964, Christmas on State Street. You can see it's a much different State Street, bustling. And so I want to give you a picture to show the planning thought at the time. Next slide. We'll be seeing some excerpts from the general plan in that season. This is the 1964 plan. Really great stuff. I really identify with this as someone who came from Los Angeles here in 1991, dedicated to the preservation and beauty of the harmonious relationship between the natural and the man-made resources, so that Santa Barbara may continue her historic role as a home for those who seek a refuge from the commonplace. Doesn't that just say it all? Why we all fell in love with Santa Barbara. Next slide. And then continuing on, it talks about in the general plan in 1964, how we are not going to be like Los Angeles. It says there's a growing awareness in most communities that the automobile is getting out of hand, that its influence on the urban scene is becoming dictatorial rather than beneficial. It is the instrument whereby free rein has given to urban sprawl, you know, the four-letter word, urban sprawl. With the increase of population and prosperity, the automobile is demanding more and more land for its exclusive use. All the city needs is a few more cars to attain the unhappy distinction of becoming like Los Angeles. Yeah, and that just really says it all. This is the Santa Barbara that Commissioner Lodge grew up in, and a lot of us know about it. We've been here a while, and I got to say, coming in 91, I was not a part of this history. Really understand that the roots of Santa Barbara is an anti-traffic congestion model. It's a pro-people and spaces for people so that we can be a part of the place that is uncommon. Next slide. So that's where we find ourselves when we think about traffic congestion, and Santa Barbara also has roots in resisting traffic expansion. This is a 1969. This was in April, so the oil spill was in January, and this is when Caltrans was talking about the Crosstown Freeway, which at the time had traffic signals. Well, it's kind of interesting. They're talking about that in 1969. The traffic signal didn't go out till the year I got here, which is October 91, as I was actually here for the ceremony to lift the final signal off 101. You know, that's a lot of time to pass before the city was willing to actually let that go, because we as Santa Barbans think that that's preposterous. And in this day was antithetical because of the oil spill, which arguably started the environmental movement in California. It's antithetical to that thinking. Next slide. So between 1980 and 2000, we were resisting. We had strong traffic thresholds, but we also spent a lot of money on traffic improvements. We did the Crosstown Freeway. The big dots on the freeway that you're seeing are the super size of the existing interchanges. We made them bigger, better, moving more cars than we can imagine. We completed roads in the waterfront that weren't there. Garden Street, the connection of Salsa Puentes, now Calle Cesar Chavez, to the beach. Korea Corridor went from 4 to 6 lanes. Upper State Street got a smart corridor and new signals and timing. And these improvements dramatically changed Santa Barbara lifestyle. That picture that you recall from 1974 with the congestion on Upper State Street, after these improvements were done, there was no congestion on Upper State Street. In fact, we, as traffic planners, the traffic planners that came right before me, when we did the Crosstown Freeway, had no idea, because it's a grid and because the street grid carries so many cars, we had no idea how many cars were going through that system. And when the Crosstown Freeway went on and everyone just said, okay, I'll just take the freeway, I can get by, I don't need to go around the signals, all of a sudden town felt sleepier, not as much traffic. That was a profound moment because in the city of Santa Barbara, as Dave Davis, he was the guy who hired me, always said, there's only 3 issues in Santa Barbara. It's water, traffic, and housing. And those issues come and go. Well, this was the moment right in 2000 where all the issues went away for us, and we no longer really thought in traffic congestion because there really wasn't any. It was all on the freeway. Next slide. So in the general plan, when we went through that, we looked at the objectives of the general plan before it was written, and there were primary objectives. And the hardest ones to balance are the two that are circled. You want a strong, diverse economy, which means you're going to have growth. And on the other hand, you don't want any traffic. And usually growth means traffic. So that's a really hard thing to balance. How do you balance the need to grow and do it while actually reducing traffic congestion on the street? That's what we set out to do with the general plan update. Next slide. So with the growth management plan, we had some stipulations. You're all familiar with average unit density now. That's our housing piece. You know, do the housing. You may not know that we restricted commercial square footage quite a bit, very similar to the first restriction that was back in the 80s. And then we developed this traffic management strategy. So let's go through that and look at see what that looks like. Next slide. These are the intersections that the EIR for the general plan update found were congested. And what you'll recognize in these locations is they're all along the freeway. It's where the most traffic trips are going to be going from the city. Next slide. In the old way, and this was during the environmental impact report evaluation of the general plan, the old method of traffic evaluation, which is exactly what the state wanted to get rid of with the SB 743, is that we, next slide, we selected a site. So here's our site, and this site comes in for, let's say, an improvement. And then we follow the trips from the improvement, and voila, the trips go through an impacted intersection. It's what many will recall as the one trip threshold. And guess what? This commercial real estate could not be developed in the city of Santa Barbara if one of its trips went through an impacted intersection. So we were not doing a lot of development in the core because of this traffic threshold. And it's exactly what the state legislation is trying to prevent us from doing, is saying, hey, don't do this project, even though this project's in the core. We're saying it can't be done because it's got a traffic impact. Well, next slide. So when we did the EIR and we did cumulative effects, guess what we found out? We found out our general plan, any development pretty much was going to be a cumulative impact. It just didn't matter where you developed. Sooner or later, one of those trips is going to make its way to the freeway, and it's a complete impact. So we had to do overriding considerations for cumulative effects. Next slide. And then, so the general plan, this is the EIR, found that 27 intersections were impacted in the 2030 build out. There's few possibilities for improvements. Remember, all those improvements we already did. You can't supersize the interchanges anymore if the road going to the interchanges is only so wide. You have to get into widening, say, like Mission and Garden and all the other streets going to the intersections, and then it becomes even less a Santa Barbara feel. So we're kind of at the max for the amount of roadway capacity we could possibly build. And then what we found, the last thing, which I already pointed out, is that all the projects with new floor area contribute to the impacted intersections. So the general plan, the whole general plan, as we are showing, everything we were proposing had a cumulative impact. Next slide. So what is the answer to that? Well, the primary goal of the traffic management strategy is understanding that we can't build a lot of roadway capacity anymore, is to utilize existing transportation capacity efficiently and to reserve constrained transportation capacity for high priority land uses. In other words, we don't have a lot of capacity at intersections. You think about Gardens, pretty tapped out. You think about Carrillo Interchange, pretty tapped out. Of the remaining capacity before failure, we're saying, hey, let's make sure the projects that we really planned on and we really wanted are the ones that use that as we grow. Again, it's the balance between economy and traffic congestion. Next slide. some really interesting findings from the general plan and the modeling that we did. This is the one that fascinates me the most. So this is employees and arguably the employment center, key employment centers downtown. Cottage also has a big one, Upper State Street, of course, and there's some minor ones around the city. The key one downtown has by far the biggest. Look at where everyone's coming from to go to work. So in downtown, you find that 29% are actually coming from downtown. They live in downtown. Those people are probably not driving a car to work. They're more likely going to be walking, biking, using transit, Uber for sure. And then downtown employees who live in the rest of Santa Barbara. So the city limits. You work downtown and you live within the city limits, 32%. But here's the problem, and this is the big problem. This is what the state is also getting at with VMT. Almost 40% of all people who work in downtown are coming from somewhere else outside of the city. Well, that's a transportation problem. Well, next slide, look at the converse statistics on where people actually live. So if you live in downtown and you live there, of the residents who live there, look at this, 43% work in downtown. So if you live in downtown, you're most likely gonna actually work in downtown. And then even better, if you live in downtown, you're 47%, you're gonna live somewhere in the city proper. That means 90% of the people who live in downtown Santa Barbara don't even leave the city every day. They don't work outside the city. It's beautiful. Only 10% of the people who live downtown actually drive out of the city limit. Well, that is beautifully instructive for planning and where we should place our land use, particularly housing in this case. We should put it downtown, because if you put a house downtown, it's going to have the least amount of traffic effect. Next slide. So putting all this stuff together, we took a look at, for the first time, before we were talking about these Institute of Traffic Engineers manuals with trip generation rates and studies from all over the United States, which are not similar to Santa Barbara, and we looked at what is the Santa Barbara trip rate. Well, it turns out if you place a house, you place a commercial, you place retail in that box, number one, you have the lowest traffic footprint of any place you could put land use in the city of Santa Barbara. You find the least amount of trips. And then if you put it in box two, which incidentally is the entire street grid, the original grid that was laid out in 1853, if you put land uses in that grid, you're also going to have a very, very low trip generation. But if you put buildings in 4 and 3, zones 4 and 3, you're going to have the most traffic generation. In fact, it's half. So if you put in a commercial office building in, let's say, on Upper State Street versus in Zone 1, you're going to have half the traffic for that office building in Zone 1 than you would on Upper State Street. It's a huge difference. So we let the slide you're showing, which is the statistical data on transportation, guide the next slide. Let's look at it. The next slide is what we decided to do with development areas. And it matches the model perfectly. We said, hey, if you want to develop in the green area, that we're going to call that the downtown development area, knock yourself out. Put your housing there. Put all your square footage. That's where the 1.35 million is going to end up. It's going to end up in that box. But if you want to develop in what we're calling the outline areas, which is Mesa, Upper State, Riviera, Coast Village Road, you only get 1,000 square foot addition. That's all you get with your land use. You can't take from the other pots of square footage. And then on top of that, if you want to transfer it, because we have and it's spelled out in the traffic management strategy, if you want to transfer development, you can transfer it downtown, but you can't transfer it out of downtown to the outline areas. And then we said, okay, well, we're going to be flexible. If you want to tear down a building, let's say in the Upper State Street area, you can build the same amount of square footage if you tear it down, because you're not changing the total capacity or traffic generation that much, if at all. This, what you're looking at, is a pretty revolutionary strategy for traffic management. And this is when we did what the state is asking us to do now. We actually implemented what the intent of SB 743 at this moment with our 2011 general plan update and the growth management strategy. Next slide. So this is what we did. We also, the third bullet, we streamlined the development of traffic review because we no longer did the one trip threshold. We didn't do it. We said it was much different. We created because we put the development where it should be and planned it where it should be. We didn't need that traffic threshold. Next slide. And we changed the threshold because we said, hey, if you're in the general plan and you build something that's according to the general plan, you get a green light, thumbs up, no traffic evaluation. Next slide. And that's when council overrided the cumulative impact. But we added a threshold for project specific impact level. And we said that's too much because, and this is what it says in the traffic management strategy, because a single project is using a disproportionate share of the remaining roadway capacity. Remember, there's only a little bit left in those intersections next to the freeway. We don't want one project taking it up all of it for the many projects that might be good. So next slide, what does it mean when someone's taking a disproportionate share? Well, a disproportionate share would be if a project uses 1% of the remaining capacity at an intersection. That's the standard. And it would be at one of those 27 impacted intersections. Now, what's really interesting about this exercise, because when we did this, we were trying to figure out, well, how many of these would we get? Like how many projects would be so big to trigger that 1%? Well, here's the answer. Next slide. Only one project. Only one project did it. Actually, it's going to be the next one. Stay here for a second. So cumulative threshold overridden by city council. So no one needs to do that. In fact, in planning, there's always a statement with every single exemption approval that says it attaches that project square footage with the overriding considerations that the council and the planning commission enacted. And then the project specific threshold, when we analyze it as staff, is we kind of do a back of napkin. Hey, is this big enough? Could it possibly trigger something in an intersection? And the magic number is 16 on a critical movement. That's really technical. You don't need to know that. But we look at that. And then if the answer is possibly yes, then we have a traffic model done. And then the traffic model decides based on all the assumptions we did in the general plan. So it's actually very elegant. The next slide shows the only project that I believe, okay, not yet, sorry. So and then we have the traffic analysis fees, which we do. And the traffic analysis fees are $5,500. That's what you pay. You don't have to pay for an expensive traffic study. We do a traffic model validation also with the fees we collect with land development. So in the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to be doing another model run and a more sophisticated one that will account for the expansion of the freeway. And then we have an adaptive management program that is doing just what we're doing today. It's evaluating the traffic management strategy and it's changing it according to the changing conditions. And then we're going to adjust the number of intersections with each model run. We haven't gotten to the mitigation plan, and that's kind of a bummer. We still haven't tackled that one. I think there's great concern, or there's concern that we should be doing that. The challenge is that there's no money to do that. We don't have an RDA anymore. And so we'd have to actually have trip fees to enact that, and that would mean a greater expense for development. So that's a conversation for the Planning Commission to have with the council. Next slide. I think we're going to see that project now. There it is. So the project at what is it, 301 Yananali, I believe that's it. Is that it? Chair Schwartz, okay, she's nodding. This project actually triggered that model run. And I gotta say, we used to have almost every project triggered. So there's one project, and of course, they thought it was so unfair. And I'm just smiling. And I'm like, if you only knew the past, when no one got through, and you're the only one that's caught in the net. And the deal is they're right next to the freeway, so that adds to it. And then because they're proposing a retail use, the opportunity for this retail use, the people who they're going to serve are on the other side of the freeway. So if you did like a supermarket, or can you imagine a Whole Foods, which is one of the considerations that was on the table at one time, everybody who wants to go to Whole Foods is either going to come from the other side of the freeway, or even worse, they're going to get off the freeway and get to Whole Foods for a fast food stop or on the way to Montecito. And that makes the whole interchange congested by just one use. So everyone suffers because one use gets through. And that was the challenge. And when you think about it, Santa Barbara is not like LA. It doesn't have freeway on and off uses. You just think about kind of walking your head, driving on the freeway, where there's really none. There's no freeway. There's no big sign, and then everyone gets off of that because they're going to get back on the freeway after they've been serviced. It just doesn't exist. This would have been the first. So there was a planning commission condition of approval in this one, which requires added staff review with each land use that they recommend, and we're actually working with them on trying to get them so that they can lease it up. Grocery store is the biggest offender. Next slide. So here we are. Traffic management strategy post SB 743. This is why this item is here. This is the recommendation and the approval. What is it? Well, we're eliminating traffic congestion as a CEQA impact. That's what the state guideline says. We're no longer going to be going through the CEQA checklist and have a traffic congestion line item where we do level of service. It doesn't exist anymore. So how do we, knowing that we've actually met the intent of SB 743 with our planning, how do we keep our traffic standards, we keep our quality of life in Santa Barbara with the larger projects that may tip the scales for us at the interchanges? How do we do that? Well, the way we do that and the way we're proposing today with your recommendation to City Council is that we propose changing the language in the traffic management strategies, which is the growth management ordinance, changing the language in Exhibit A to eliminate all the CEQA terms. So we're just decoupling it from CEQA. It's still the council's policy, and it would be implemented as a policy. And whenever the Planning Commission is finding something consistent with the general plan, they'll have to find it consistent with the traffic management strategy because that is a policy of the plan. So that is the change. So when you look at all those changes in Exhibit A, they're all geared to take out the CEQA-ease, if you will, out of that policy and leave it as a policy. And then the recommendation is that we also formalize the traffic analysis guidelines in Exhibit B, and those are there to spell out the rules of the process, which have sped up the land development process significantly and made it less cost. It doesn't cost as much as it used to be. So we've made it efficient and applicants able to get through much faster. Next slide. I want to tell you a little bit about traffic analysis guidelines. This is a rough outline that Chair Schwartz and I talked about, and talks about the traffic standards, talks about intersection level of service. That's what LOS stands for, level of service. Level of service is kind of like school. You're a really good student, you got an A, that's an intersection that performs well. If you got a C, hey, you passed. And most people get through the intersection, they pass. But when you get to D, E, and F, I know we don't have E in the grade system, but that's bad. It's between D and F is failure. And that's when, the system just breaks down. That's what LOS is. And then our traffic model, which is really nice because it looks at Santa Barbara trips, very unique to us. We've kind of left the Institute of Traffic Engineers and all those studies behind to get something that really fits Santa Barbara. So it describes that. And then it describes what are the critical intersections that we're going to be looking at for adding traffic to and seeing if you get to 1% of the capacity with every project. And then it's got the traffic analysis evaluations. How does that work? Describes how that works. And then it talks about traffic model updates and how we do that. So we're happy to answer any questions about that. It's mainly technical, but we can get into that. Next slide. Okay, vehicle miles traveled. What is that? So this SB 743 is gonna it eliminates traffic congestion as a CEQA, and then it introduces this vehicle miles traveled via VMT. It's the new CEQA project measurement of transportation impact. So when the planner is going through the checklist now, they're going to be thinking about VMT. And remember, VMT is attached to greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just about traffic anymore. It's about what the length of the trip does to the air. That's what's attached to the climate change. And so that's what planners are concerned about. That's what we're looking at because we want to save the planet. Next slide. What is VMT? Oh my gosh, everyone has a different answer. So simply, it's just the vehicle distance traveled per capita. And actually, we have been talking about VMT for a long time, and you've heard it on the news. It usually comes at the end of the year when someone says, hey, Americans have traveled 350,000 miles, or million miles this year. This is how many millions of miles Americans traveled this year. And in California, we have the state that drives many, many more miles than any other state in the United States because we have more roads, longer state, and it's a denser state. So that's how far people go. So the average person goes, and then you can attach that to land uses. You could say, well, this land use, let's say, just to have the Balboa building downtown. The Balboa building has a certain vehicle miles traveled for that building. And then, of course, just as a reminder, VMT measures greenhouse gas emissions. That's what it's all about. So although it says it's a transportation impact threshold, it's really about greenhouse gas emissions. We don't want impacts to VMT because we don't want to increase greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So what are we going to do in Santa Barbara for our CEQA threshold? How do we do that? What is the VMT? Like, how do you determine that? Well, the straight up answer is it's very difficult. It's the reason these guidelines are now just becoming official July 1 is because this was the hard conversation. I mean, the traffic people, which, career 30 years, we never talked about VMT, and we don't even deal with VMT. It's actually an air quality thing. And when we talk about air quality impacts, planning usually does VMT, and they've got their own program for that. So it's kind of interesting. The assumptions that have to go into VMT are extreme. It's not going to be scientific unless you actually took license plate surveys and you followed the cars with, Google metrics to their places of origin and actually came up with the live data, which we can't do as a planning person because the building we're talking about is not populated yet. So how do we do it? Okay, well, there's some good news about answers in the state guidelines. So the state is particularly sensitive to vehicle miles traveled in transit and good planning and putting land use in the right place. The map that you're seeing on the right is the red lines are our transit lines that run through town. The orange is the housing in the AUD, and then the blue is a half mile from the transit line. So that whole entire area that you're seeing is off the table for vehicle mile traveled impacts under CEQA. Any land use that's constructed within the blue and the orange, the blue and the blue fields next to transit lines, all of that land use is assumed to not have a CEQA impact for transportation. Well, guess what? That includes almost everything, almost every commercial area in the city except for Mesa and Coast Village Road. And then on top of that, any residence that you build in the city of Santa Barbara is also not going to have a vehicle miles traveled impact under CEQA. Why is that? Well, you're all familiar with us talking about the housing balance, work housing balance, right? And we already know that the scales are tipped, that it favors It favors work and less housing. We have a need for housing. So any housing unit that we put in the city is going to benefit. It's going to reduce the distance people travel because it's going to be one more opportunity for someone to live and work within the same city. I hope that makes sense. Next slide. Now there is one threshold that OPR with the state of California is very clear on, and this is very interesting, and this is changing completely in planning, and that is the biggest culprit of VMT, increasing VMT, is freeway widening, freeway expansion. I'll give you an example. I got this great picture. I hope you love it. This picture is 101 and State Street. The Seaside building is on the left. So Montecito Street would be on the right of the freeway. Next slide. When the last signal went out in 1991, we took the crosstown freeway out. Within 10 years, the volume on the freeway increased 67%. Why? Mainly because you could. And it turns out that housing in Santa Barbara is extremely expensive. And now, because of this crosstown freeway, you could even work in Goleta and drive from the South Coast, from beyond Ventura, and get to work at a pretty decent time. So this freeway expansion made it possible for people to live further away from their jobs, and consequently increased VMT, and consequently increased greenhouse gas emissions. This is what the state is after. Next slide. So now, and we didn't have this at the time, now you have 13 to 16, 15,000 people living in Ventura County who work in the city of Santa Barbara, and even more who are working in Goleta. Or sorry, more than the total. So next slide. So that is an impact. That is an impact. If you add a freeway, you're gonna cause vehicle miles of travel to go up. And actually, one more thing on that point. Let's go back to that Balboa building. That Balboa building, VMT, which hard to determine, but let's just say it's X. The VMT is X. In other words, the people who are working at the Balboa building live a certain distance away, and that VMT is the number X. With a freeway expansion, we didn't do anything to the Balboa building, but the VMT of the Balboa building goes up because of the freeway expansion made more people be able to live further away from their jobs. So actually the biggest challenge with roadway capacity that OPR is telling us is that every single land use that's already on the ground, you're not even approving, they're on the ground, their vehicle miles traveled will go up as roadway capacity goes up, and consequently greenhouse gas emissions. So if you think about the widening that we're talking about now, and I know Timmy Bolton's talked about it from a greenhouse gas perspective, but we've been doing really great with greenhouse gases. Like we're doing good. The freeway gives us a big blip up because it changes all the greenhouse gas emissions of the existing land uses that are on the ground in Santa Barbara. And he's a great one to ask about that. Okay, next slide, and I'm almost done. We're going to talk a little bit about this threshold. So we're not proposing today to have a threshold for VMT. We'd like to do that under the Climate Action Plan. Planning is supportive of that. We will have a model run at the time, so we'll have a little bit more science behind any threshold that we do create. It'll be very updated. And again, it's important to remember there's really only 2 commercial places. It's got to be commercial square footage goes in. And maybe I probably shouldn't exclude the airport. There's 3 commercial spaces where if you put in land use, you're going to have the potential of having a the new transportation CEQA impact under vehicle miles traveled. And I think, next slide, I think that is, Timmy, wave the mouse if that's the last slide. I think that's the last slide. So happy to answer any questions about the whole thing. Again, I know it's a mouthful, the action that you're doing today is specifically related to the traffic management strategy and doing the traffic management strategy, and then also doing formalizing the traffic analysis guidelines.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dayton. This was an excellent presentation, and I'm so pleased that we had an opportunity to talk in advance of today's.
Chair Schwartz, it appears that you've frozen on us. Hang on just 1 second. Let's see if we can try to turn her webcam off and then back on.
Am I back?
You are back and you're not
Okay.
frozen anymore. So if you wouldn't
Okay.
mind just starting again, sorry.
Sure. I just was a note of appreciation to Mr. Dayton to say that I'm really pleased that we had the opportunity to fold into your presentation that breadth and depth of information we discussed. I'm hoping that the commissioners found it beneficial. And as I ask the commissioners to be poised to come online with questions, we're going to start with questions. I just want to remind us all where we're headed is with 2 recommendations. We find this on page 2 of our staff report. The first recommendation is that our commission will recommend to council to amend the traffic management strategy to remove outdated CEQA references and replace it with policy level review. We find that in Exhibit A. The second recommendation, also to council, would be to adopt the land development team traffic analysis guidelines describing methodologies and procedures to analyze traffic congestion effects under the strategy that's in Exhibit B. So with that, let me go to Commissioner Higgins for questions, please.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Pardon my interruption, Commissioner Schwartz and Commissioner Higgins, or Chair Schwartz, did you want to open up public comment first before questions?
Thank you so much, Ms. Kokinda. I was eager to get to commissioner questions. Let's do that. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak to us on this item?
Okay, and
Anybody in
just
the
as
queue?
just a reminder, if anyone wishes to speak, to please raise your hand using the hand icon and I will call on you. I do not see anyone at the moment who wishes to speak. So I will
Okay.
let you know if I do see someone raise their hand, okay?
Okay, thank you so much. Commissioner Higgins, back to you, please, for any questions to Mr. Dayton or Ms. Grant.
Sure. So question for Mr. Dayton. What's your understanding of how other cities are handling the sort of belt and suspenders, keeping both constructs in play? Are a lot of cities completely eliminating LOS from their general plan process or other land use procedures? I'm curious just generally because I know the intent, but now we have another set of rules to follow that doesn't sound like it's going to be burdensome, but for maybe, 1 or 2 projects. So what's going on there? Give me maybe some background for how other cities are handling that.
Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Higgins, thank you that's a great question. And actually, we've heard from a lot of people, as I think you and I have spoken on the same panel talking at conferences about this over the last 3 years. And a lot of people are been asking us, same question. Well, what are you doing? What are other people doing? The challenge is that this measure was really designed for Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, San Jose. It was designed for the big city. And so in those cities, they are throwing traffic congestion out the window. I forget what the SCAG transportation plan is for Los Angeles now, but it's spent trillions of dollars and it only gets 600% worse. So I can't speak for. I can speak for them because I know what they're doing. I don't know what the smaller cities are doing. and haven't had my finger on the pulse of that. So I don't know what they're doing.
And Chair Schwartz, you're muted right now.
As we go to commissioner questions, if I could ask you if you're going to reference specific portions of our package. Number one, I've noticed that we don't have pagination. We don't have page numbers for every single page going through our packet. So if you would go slowly in referencing the specific document and a page or a paragraph, that way Timothy Bolton, who's waiting in the wings to assist us technologically, can bring that up and we can all see that portion of a particular document in question. So to you, Commissioner Wiscombe, for questions, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to commend Mr. Dayton on that great presentation. It was very informative and very entertaining, and really was an eye-opener to some of our history here in Santa Barbara. And I guess we can give a kudos to Commissioner Lodge for contributing to that. Yeah. I just have a few questions, and they're really clarifications because I think you covered them in the presentation. Looking specifically at the traffic management strategy, which is Exhibit A. So, and on page 1, it states that the intent is to minimize expected traffic impacts while balancing need for economic development and to establish a simplified, less costly development entitlement process. So you did touch on this, I think. Did you say $5,500 per project? Is that right? So that's the simplified and less costly process that developers will go through. They'll pay, and then streamlined development threshold, you mentioned that. So are those the two things that relate to the simplified and less costly development process?
Chair Schwartz and Commissioner Wiscombe, it is. I will also just add, though, that most people do not pay the $5,500. You only pay that if we believe you might be adding 1% or taking away 1% of an intersection's capacity. And that really rarely happens. I think that we've pulled the trigger on the 5,500, which means there's a model run involved. I think we've done that 3 times, and I think we're about to do it for a 4th time. So when you think about that from 2011, most people, they don't need to have a traffic engineer. It's a huge shift from where we were, and instead of having the level of service roadblock dictate the planning, we've placed the land uses where we're saying, hey, go here where you'll have the least amount of impact.
Right. Okay. That's great. Okay. I just wanted to make sure, because so the $5,500 fee is triggered if you need to run the study.
You run the model.
Okay. Great. Run the model. Okay. And then on this same traffic management strategy, on page 6, I think it's at the top of the page, it describes a review authority. So that word always gives me pause. So what is the review authority? It's right at the first sentence on page 6. The review authority must make a determination of overriding considerations.
I think we called it review authority because Allison's going to answer the question. I don't think we thought it was, we didn't know if it was council or planning commission or if it was either, and sometimes it shifts. Did I get it right, Allison?
That's correct, Rob. Yes, Vice Chair Wiscombe, the review authority depends on the project itself. Sometimes the design review board is the designated review authority. Sometimes it's the staff hearing officer, and that is outlined in our zoning ordinance where the review authority is defined.
Okay, so it is a defined role then, so we can rest
Correct.
assured that, yeah, okay. And
Yes,
then,
it's defined in Title 30.
thank you so much. And then on the same page, in the same paragraph, so I'm still on page 6, you talk about making a determination of overriding considerations, which may be made as a finding of overriding considerations under CEQA. I think I get what you're trying to say, Mr. Dayton, but maybe that needs a little cleanup language, or if you could just clarify what your intent was there, because it was pretty much a lot of overriding consideration.
Well, actually, the biggest chore here is try not to say the word impact, that's not allowed anymore. Yeah, so we struggle with this because it needs to be a reasonably understood way for the Planning Commission and the public to understand what's going on. So the attorney wasn't afraid of associating the policy discussion with intertwined or alongside the CEQA discussion. So, we couldn't really come up with a better word than overriding considerations. And so many people understand that word and what it means in our planning process that we didn't think it was worth it to try to develop something new.
Okay. It's just that it's twice in one sentence, which is pretty scary. Okay. And then my final question, actually, this is more of a, you talked about, I think you talked about this. On page 8 and 9, there's a discussion about developing a city traffic congestion reduction program to be included in the AMP, the Adaptive Management Program. So did you say in your presentation that there's no money for this at this point?
Yeah, Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Wiscombe. Yeah, it's a little money and it's a little political will. I think the main mitigation of the 2011 EIR, the most effective thing from the modeling approach was pricing parking on street. So that's not a money issue because obviously the price parking generates revenue, and that's a political issue. And actually we might be getting closer to that as we try to maneuver how to sustain a downtown and a parking system and develop revenues for economic development. That's a different subject. But that I think was accountable for something like 80% of the success of the mitigation plan. So that's the political aspect. And then the monetary ones were, there was a pretty extensive list of across the town minor tweaks. Minor tweaks with an intersection. You remember on the Upper State Street study, if you were here then, we talked about a signal at Macaw, and there was a couple other signals, and there was some pathways here, and all the bicycle improvements we have been able to fund through grant funding, and so we have been moving forward those. So it's both cost and political environment that are challenging the mitigation plan, and we haven't formalized it. So after if you would find all the details in the environmental document mitigation plan program, but we haven't formalized it and made it part of the planning mechanics here.
Okay. So are there any grants to formalize this, or is there no money available for that? I'm just,
well,
it seems like it would be a great tool to have in the adaptive management program, but so
it would be, and the price parking does do the high leverage, and you've seen me probably try to do that in the funk zone, and I think we can do that and still give away the parking complimentary to locals as an interim bridge to success. But we still need to have that conversation with the community. And since that's such a significant portion of the benefit that we get, I've kind of been less enthusiastic about rushing to slaughter.
there's the political will part, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's all my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. And We'll certainly allow for a second round of questions if there are. We don't need to truncate this because clearly Mr. Dayton, I'm sure with participation by Ms. Grant, have put a lot of time and thought into presenting to us today. Ms. DeBus, did you want to jump in and be part of this as well?
Yes, thank you, Chair Schwartz. I just wanted to mention, before this item started, you mentioned that Jessica Grant was here to answer questions. And I also wanted to let you know that Julia Peugeot, who is our new environmental analyst, is also available to answer any environmental related questions that you may have.
Oh, I'm so glad you introduced her. I know of Ms. Peugeot, but I didn't know that she's formally joined the city.
She has. She's been with us for about 2 months.
Okay, welcome, Ms. Peugeot.
And forgive me for not introducing her. And she's been a rock star as we've developed this, and really has hit the ground running like she's been here all along.
Okay, wow, terrific. Great, let's go to Commissioner Lodge, please, with questions. I think your mic is not on yet, Commissioner Lodge. Let's do a sound check.
Correctly.
We can hear you now. Great.
You can hear me now, right? Okay. Did I hear you correctly, Mr. Dayton? You said the Balboa building with freeway expansion, EMT goes up. Is that what
Correct.
you said?
Correct. The whole city, but we're just using that as a case in point.
Okay, well, when I was reading this, by the way, an excellent presentation on your part, as Commissioner Wiscombe said. As I was reading the staff report, I was remembering the EIR for Caltrans for the expansion. Or as I recall, it was hidden someplace in an appendix, the effect that when the freeway is completed, the widening is completed, we have a lot more impacted intersections on our surface streets. Am I remembering correctly?
Yes, I think what you're remembering, Commissioner Lodge, is that staff came forward with some compendium analysis based on the Caltrans analysis to show specifically what the freeway's effects of releasing about 1,800 more cars per hour into the city and how that would impact under the CEQA terms, the intersections primarily around the freeway off ramps. Yes.
In other words,
yes.
It's going to be worse. In other words,
it's going to be significantly worse. And the things, this is the plagued mind of a transportation planner who lives in the future and gets so concerned about these things, because if you recall, when the signals were in, we had a lot more traffic in going through the grid. And you may have noticed how Goleta's building quite a lot of housing, which is good. But the intersection congestion between Santa Barbara and Goleta in the last 8 years has really gone up. And so when you add the incoming from the freeway and then the greater capacity the freeway is going to create, and remember, the freeway expansion is a housing mitigation. If you read the principles that SBCAG is putting forth, is we're doing this because people can't afford to live here. So we're expecting people to provide easier for them to live there. So we want that to grow because we want people to live away. So that means that there's this thing called induced travel, which OPR of the state and the SB 743 that we're talking about, they go wild on induced travel and say that everyone who didn't believe in that was wrong and not believing in science type of comments. So my question, Commissioner Lodge, when we've gotten the OPR in the room at these conferences is how you guys get along with Caltrans? You guys talk? What is the conversation like at home?
oh goodness. Okay, well, I still have a problem figuring out how do you assign, I think I know what a VMT is. How do you assign them to a particular project? I mean, it sounds as if you're supposed to be taking into consideration, some of the some of the, if it's a business, it's going to have new employees. Some of them will be living in Ventura, some of them will be living in town. How do you figure that all out?
So Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Lodge, we don't. We don't. You know, and I know everyone who went to any conference is probably cursing me now, but you know, some people thought that traffic was an art. Trying to figure out the VMT of any building is and predicting what that's going to be at an average level is a very difficult thing. So here's how we look at this, and this is germane to your question. This is how we look at this. We believe as planners that we are, I mean, you yourself experienced this with impacts to growth. We are way ahead of the curve in California planning. The city of Santa Barbara has is in the top 10 cities of all of the United States for the lowest traffic generation per land use. We have the highest transit. We have the same amount of transit as a city, another American city that has 1 million people. We have planned, when we made the decision in '81 not to increase parking requirements downtown, and now we're talking about housing without parking, and people are laughing. All those decisions have played into exactly what SB 743 is trying to accomplish. So what we believe, Commissioner Lodge, is that we've done what the legislative intent was with this. And we've not only did we did it in the CEQA process, we put it in the policy. We limited commercial growth. We're accentuating housing in our downtown. We're doing all the right things to protect the climate and not increase greenhouse gas emissions. So for the few places that the state says we might have some VMT impacts, again, commercial area of Coast Village Road, the Mesa, and the airport. Those are the only places under the guidelines that we would have an impact. We just believe it's not a big deal. And when we get to the climate action plan, we're going to define that. And here's what I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be if the land use is higher than the average of the county. And unless they build like some kind of office tower, which we don't allow, it's not going to be higher than the average VMT of the county. I hope that helps.
I think so. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Schwartz.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Reed, questions for staff?
Mr. Dayton, good afternoon.
Commissioner Reed.
So you identified a large area where projects would not fall under the VMT methodology. They wouldn't have a significant transportation impact. And as I'm reading the staff report on page 2, that's largely due to those areas being well served by major transit stops.
That's correct. And Mr. Bolton may want to bring that up, or I don't know if Ms. DeBusk has control of that. There it is.
Is that the slide, Commissioner Reed, you were referencing, or this is slide 43? Is there a different map, or is this the map?
That's the map.
Great.
So that's wonderful for Santa Barbara as it stands today, and for developing in that sector. What conceivably could change, could be triggered, that could tighten up that map and subject projects to the VMT review?
That's a great question, Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Reed. So if MTD went under and there was no transit on those lines, then the none within half mile of transit line would be gone, and the entire downtown would be subject commercially to VMT impacts. Having said that, we still have yet to develop our threshold. And like I was just telling Commissioner Lodge, I still think your best bet is to develop downtown where the synergies are, and you're most likely to get people walking, bicycling to work. It's one of the few places in America where you get more trips via walking, biking, Uber, transit in the core. So even without the transit, we're still going to have a heavy amount of walking and biking. So that, like, if you imagine, if the threshold is better than the county average, think of the county average, and there might be a land use in Santa Maria, or they might be a land use in Solvang, or Los Oso, or Santa Ynez, or Goleta. All those places, of all those places that go into the average, the place that you'll find the least amount of travel is going to be downtown Santa Barbara, where you have synergies, and the vehicle miles traveled are going to be less because you have less people going those greater distances, where the land uses that are in other places of the county are more remote and you need to bring a car to that location just to access it, are going to be higher. So I think that even if the transit was to disappear, which I don't think it will, I think that our threshold that we're going to develop, and you'll get an opportunity to participate that in the climate action plan, I think the threshold would develop it would take a pretty intense, large, out of scale Santa Barbara development to trigger a VMT threshold impact.
Thank you. And Commissioner Wiscombe touched on cost a little bit. What do you anticipate in added time in the development process, given these changes?
Great question, Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Reed. This is done. The VMT will be done as a part of the CEQA process, so it's done concurrently with all the other impact evaluation. So it doesn't add time unless for some reason there's an impact and we have to talk about mitigation. And then we've already talked about how unlikely that is. So I don't think there's any difference in the time.
Okay, great. And then just a verbiage question. I noticed in Exhibit A, it stated policy traffic effect a number of times. And then I would see traffic congestion effect listed a number of times. Are those the same, or is there a difference?
They are the same. And we're using those words because we can't say impact anymore, because we say impact and people think CEQA. So you should have been in the room when we first started trying to use these terms. You've got a rut that's so deep, it's hard to move to a different language.
Okay, and then last question. In Exhibit A, this is on page 4. You mentioned La Cumbre Plaza and the 5 Points properties specifically in that first paragraph on the page. And you speak to, at the time of major development or redevelopment, a traffic study would be conducted to determine the specific traffic effects. And I know there are projects under consideration right now for La Cumbre Plaza in particular. Has that traffic study gotten underway?
Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Reed, no, we haven't seen a project come through the door. Yes, we've heard rumors as well about when that might be coming in. And the reason we handle it that way is because we're anticipating that property to be evaluated under a specific plan, which really loosens it creates a much more flexible discussion. And we just want to call out that under the traffic management strategy, that specific plan needs to be evaluated to ensure, or at least eyes wide open, what its traffic effects will be. It's going to be more than, say, if you're just adding to one building, because it's a larger property and it's mostly all commercial, and they're talking about housing too. So it's a little bit more complex and it needs the higher evaluation.
Okay, and I assume La Cumbre Plaza and 5 Points are both within a major traffic stop, so it's exempt from the VMT?
That's correct.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Reed. Commissioner Escobedo, questions for staff, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dayton, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for the historical context. It was really enjoyable. I want to go back to Commissioner Lodge's question and just make sure that I understand it correctly. When looking at VMT, it sounds like it's a pretty qualitative or subjective assessment. Is that correct?
That's
and
correct.
then earlier in the presentation, I think I heard you right that when we do our climate action plan update, we're going to have a new traffic model that might be a little bit more quantitative. Is that correct?
Yeah, Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Escobedo, when the best you'll get with VMT is going to be with our traffic model. Having said that, the traffic model also makes assumptions on how far people go. It knows how many, it just doesn't know exactly how far. But Google Metrics actually is really improved quite a bit. And the people, and maybe it's you, gave permission for Google to do whatever they want with you. It's funny. I can pay for the data for any day and any hour from Google, and they'll give me exactly what the congestion level and exactly how far people went. So our hope is, yes, our hope is with that climate action plan, as you asked, that we'll have the traffic model to go concurrently with it, because we think that it will support that. And so, dealing with COVID right now, kind of everything's in the air about exactly the timing of things. And we're all hands on deck for economic development. As soon as I leave this call, I'm going to be working on State Street. We're probably going to be walking up and down State Street. The governor's opened it up. So the timing of whether the climate action plan and the model will sync up, we're hopeful, and that's our goal.
And then a follow-up is, when we hopefully have this more quantitative data, what sort of useful applications can we use to maybe push forward on some other policy areas, whether it's shared mobility or increasing our public transportation infrastructure?
That's a great question, because what it'll tell us how we're doing as a city compared to the county average. So that'll be very instructive for us. And then your question is like, how are we going to use that data? Say more about that.
I'm just asking you, is there a useful application when we do have that data to then push forward on other fronts? I know we were going to have some more shared mobility options with e-bikes and that sort of route, but can some of this VMT data be used to inform either increasing bus line capacity or adding other forms of alternate transportation?
I see where you're going. It's not really related. I mean, it's an interesting thought, and I want to think about that more. As I kind of mentioned, the heavy lift is the parking policy. We've pressed forward on the bicycling. In fact, this commission hasn't heard it yet, but you'll be delighted to know that Places for Bikes is ranking us this year as the 3rd best city for bicycling in the United States. We're hoping to be #1 in about 5 years. We're doing that. It's going to be, and then the electric bikes you mentioned, we have an electric bike share fleet rolling out hopefully in September. COVID, we've managed it through COVID. We're trying to keep it on track. This city is going to be amazingly friendly for cycling, and we're hoping to see that from a health standpoint, from a transportation standpoint, the benefits. The whole point of the presentation, if you missed the 100,000 foot level, is that we have no room to build for cars. And that means if we're going to be economically sustainable and going to grow, we have to do it in a way that insists that we don't do it with vehicles. That's why I'm such a proponent of building residential downtown without parking. And I know a lot of people say, well, I could never live there. And I kind of just want to say, okay, then don't. We want someone that has a lifestyle that is not going to affect everybody else's. Hey, we're here first. We love paradise. Don't screw it up. So, that's the kind of discussion we have to have. I don't know how, in answer to your question, I don't know how much the VMT data from a modeling standpoint instructs those things, but let me think about that. That's an interesting question.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Escobedo. Commissioner Bonderson, questions for staff?
Thank you, Chair Schwartz. I'd like to begin by commending Ms. DeBusk and Mr. Dayton, and of course, Ms. Grant, who we haven't seen here today, but we know she's behind a lot of this work as well. And to all the city staff members who are involved in preparing the materials that we were provided just to read up and prepare for this hearing. I found the staff report and the exhibits to be extremely thorough and easy to understand. And that's always an extremely welcomed way of preparing. And I also appreciate the extensive background history and the references that were provided as part of that material, because it allowed me to easily find more information to pursue my personal research to understand this material and prepare for the presentation today. So I didn't expect such a great addition to all the materials, but I just want to thank Mr. Dayton for his outstanding presentation and also the enthusiasm that makes it so easy to follow it and really keep our interest. So I hope that if that isn't already an expected standard, that this could become the minimum standard for all staff reports and presentations and hearing materials, because it just really made me feel like I came to this meeting prepared and ready to go, and it was very useful. So thank you to all staff involved in this presentation and all the hearing materials this time. Thank you so very much. I want to address a question to Mr. Dayton, please. I'm curious to know, with the information that you presented today and the materials, of course, that continuously reflect on updating the materials as data then comes in. And as we put this new strategy into effect and apply it, we would expect tangible data to measure the success of this proposed policy amendment and the strategies that are being applied. How frequently do you expect that measurement to take place? And once you do have data, how and when do you plan to apply it to updates? How do we update, and how do we expect, as decision makers, how do we expect to see those being presented to us in the future?
Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Bonderson, that's a really good question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about how we pay for the model. Because the model is the answer to your question. The model, when we get the model, we will be able to project the new number of intersections that are going to have problems. And the answer I'm mainly interested in, and that's why we've kind of held off on the model a little bit. The main answer I really want to know, and I think Santa Barbans want to know, is how is the freeway really going to impact the city? And I think we've done some really good work using the Caltrans numbers. Now the Caltrans numbers don't believe, they only applied about 3 to 5% induced travel, because it was a real difficult discussion with staff. There's a lot of folks in the United States who don't believe in induced travel. Induced travel is, if you build it, they will come. The state now, from the climate change position, is saying, actually, if you build it, they do come. And I've always said, if freeways solve congestion, LA would have no congestion. So it's like, if you build it, they actually do come. So so that would be the very interesting thing. What if we really assign the induced travel that OPR is saying will happen with the freeway and ran the model that way? It'd be much worse than the one we have now on the Caltrans model that they did. So I'm interested in that. How is the model paid for? This is really cool. When we set this up, we said, hey, how long of a period of time of growth will we go before we need the answers to the questions you're asking? How is the data changing, and how is the level of service to intersections changing? And we did some quick math and So we have a dollar amount subscribed to every development in the city. It's a very small amount, but it's enough so that when enough development is on the table, we have the money to pay for a model run. So when the money's there, it's the right time because enough development has happened that the scene has changed, and we'll see a change. So we've been waiting a little bit longer because I do want to use that Google metrics. I want to have a sophisticated model that it's very hard to do three-dimensional modeling. The peak hour from in non-COVID times from the south is more like a 2.5 hour peak. And so there's what's called peak hour condensing that happens when you create capacity. People don't go the time they want to go because it's too congested. So they might be going really early or maybe a little later in the morning. Once the freeway's in, people will go, oh, I got to go to the time I want to go. And we'll see an intensification at the peak hour that is our peak hour, which is really just a peak 40 minutes. So really, really interesting discussion and a good question that you ask. And the answer is with the model data, we'll have all the new upgrades to those data points.
Thank you very much for addressing that. I've always been a very big advocate for reducing the distance between where people work, where people who are working in Santa Barbara actually live and where they're coming from, because it doesn't only impact our air quality and our traffic levels, but because we are making such an effort here to improve the environment, the air quality, and also our pleasure of driving to and from work. You know, there's a benefit to the personal experience as well. And I think that the data is really going to demonstrate if we are achieving those goals. So thank you so much. Thank you again for your presentation. All this material and information has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. Those are any other questions right now for staff? No. Commissioner Higgins, a second round of questions, please.
Sure. I'm sorry if this was covered. I just had to take an emergency call. But my question is, if you know, the kind of philosophy here is that if you build it, they come. The opposite is true. If the traffic is bad, VMTs go down, right?
Sorry, Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Higgins. Yeah, and you know, I don't, as a transportation planner, I don't like that approach. I've heard that around circles, you know, the planning, the APA conferences that we've gone, the transportation conferences. Hey, just let congestion get really bad so that no one can get there. I mean, that's not Santa Barbara for sure, and many people don't understand that Santa Barbara's alternative transportation program is all about having people drive without congestion. They think we're trying to take their car keys away. I'm saying, no, we want you to drive. We just want you to drive congestion free. So we need to attract as many people as we can and get them to cycle and have a better lifestyle or walk or live closer to work or take that bus or shed that second car and rely on Uber in the interim times for emergencies. That's the real drive is to not have congestion in Santa Barbara, because it's a living within our resources. It's a quality of life issue for our town. And this town is kind of walked through the history, and I hope I've done a good job of just showing that we just don't, congestion is not the uncommon place that we want to be in Santa Barbara.
Yeah, that was clear. Thank you.
Any other question? No, Commissioner Higgins, that's it on the questions. Okay. Before I go to my questions, any additional questions, second round, so to speak, from my colleagues to any of the staff members? All right. So Mr. Dayton, let me go to my questions, and I apologize if there's some overlap. I think you know the categories of my questions because I shared them with you yesterday, but let me just go down my list. Actually, the first thing I'd like to ask you to do, really to Mr. Bolton, if you would pull up slide 47 of Mr. Dayton's PowerPoint presentation pertaining to threshold development. The timing of us working on the climate action plan and traffic model run pertaining to this, did I hear you say that's to be determined or unknown at this time, or Mr. Dayton?
Madam Chair, actually, Mr. Busk might know, or if Mr. Bolton's on the line, I know they must have some, at least within a year or a season schedule.
Yeah, do we have to either one of the other staff members a general timeline for working on these two, climate action plan and the traffic model run, specifically climate action plan?
Hi, Chair Schwartz, Timmy Bolton here, Associate Planner in Long Range Planning. We are working in the background on the climate action plan right now, still sort of assessing when the rollout should be in the context of COVID. We'd actually been planning to launch our outreach campaign right about now, would have actually already started. So we're sort of retooling, figuring that all out. I think our timelines right now are by the end of 2021, we would have an adopted plan. But as I said, we're still sort of reassessing and retooling, especially in the context of the new, I believe it's called the Sustainability and Resilience Department that's getting created and how that all fits in. And there's a lot of moving parts that we're still sorting out.
I see. Okay. Thank you for that, Mr. Bolton. And then back to Mr. Dayton, if I could. If you're still with us, Mr. Dayton.
I'm here. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm just going to wait a moment till you're back here. There was I think it may have been Commissioner Reed asking about exemptions for specific plans, and I teed this up with you yesterday as well. So I know that there are new exemptions for projects consistent with a specific plan. Am I correct in understanding whether it's La Cumbre Plaza redevelopment or any other that new specific plans that come into the city then would be evaluated for potential exemption?
And
I see there are 4 criteria that I've read about that qualify as exemptions.
And that's specifically for the vehicle miles traveled impact. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And Chair Schwartz, that goes along with the narrative that we don't believe that there's going to be a project that can really have that impact as long as it's within that transit corridor and then it's consistent with the general plan. If there was a specific plan, like say on the Mesa, you raise a good point, actually. If there was a specific plan on the Mesa or a specific plan on Coast Village Road that, let's say, proposed added 25% of the total, 1.35 million commercial square feet that were anticipated over 20 years, that would have an impact.
Okay.
So I think it's possible. I don't see it in the planning tea leaves, but it's possible.
Yes, right. We don't know of it at this time. And then not in our packet per se, but in a supplemental reading that I did, it looks like there are terms that require new findings. And my curiosity, my question to you is how they'll be applied to projects. Well, first of all, that are currently in the entitlement pipeline, but also new projects. And my reading shows that there are 5 categories, if you don't mind me just calling them out.
And where are you looking at this?
Well, I've done some supplemental reading as I shared with the full commission, various other sources. This is not in our packet, but in these other links that I provided to the Planning Commission. And I've shared this with you, Mr. Dayton. So not that you have to read this word for word, but I'm just going to ask you, there are 5 categories of new findings. I'll read them out loud. Number 1, consistent with an adopted sustainable community strategy or alternative planning strategy. The second one is that it's an employment center project. The third is that it's an infill site. The fourth is that it's defined as a transit priority area. And the fifth is that it is a site that it's considered a major transit stop, and there's a very particular definition for that. So my question to you is, I'm not going to ask you to go into each one of these, of course, but first of all, question number 1, projects that are in the entitlement pipeline now, do they have to be reevaluated after July 1, which is just over 2 months, to be consistency with this? Existing projects and new projects, kind of two different, an A and a B question there for you.
Chair Schwartz, it'd be great if Ms. DeBusk would answer the question about timing. What I will say as she comes on is that as we're saying that we don't see that any project will actually trigger an impact. These are VMT. All your discussion you're talking about is VMT impacts.
Correct.
Since we're kind of saying that, well, not kind of, we are saying that we don't think it's going to trigger, then all the projects that are in the pipeline, it would be the same for them as well. But Ms. Peugeot, take it away.
Ms. Peugeot, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Hello, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Julia Peugeot. I'm the environmental analyst that started recently at the city, and I'll take a stab at answering your first question regarding projects in the pipeline. It depends on where they are in the CEQA review process come July 1st. So if they have already done CEQA, if they've been exempt, or if they've released a draft, then they do not have to go back and review that process. However, if they have not gone through CEQA yet, then they would be using those VMT standards going forward after July 1st.
Okay. And so then new projects that's existing in the pipeline. And I guess the new ones all have to be considered in light of these 5 categories. Yes, Ms. Peugeot?
Yes, that's correct. If they're in the pipeline, they haven't been determined to be complete yet, then yes.
Okay. So I don't know if this is to Ms. DeBusk in terms of process. How are we going to fold these in to, well, it's still the A and the B. How are we currently notifying applicants who are approaching the CEQA process but not yet through it, if their projects now have to be newly evaluated against these 5 categories? And then separately, what process are we going to employ to educate new applicants that they will have to undertake this process, or this process will be applied to their applications? Any thoughts for me there, Ms. DeBusk?
Yes, thank you, Chair Schwartz. For projects that we've been reviewing over the past, I'd say about a month, we've been including an analysis of both VMT and also level of service. So they understand what impacts there may be under VMT, if we're reviewing this after July 1st, and also impacts associated with level of service. And that's important because either way, we'll still be reviewing projects for level of service from a policy standpoint. So we have been letting applicants know. I don't anticipate that we'll be doing much outreach because these are the types of reviews that we do in the background. And as Mr. Dayton identified, we don't expect a lot of projects to get caught in this VMT issue, given the characteristics of the city.
But can I assume that we'll nonetheless be prepared, sort of like I say, have on the shelf this notification, review, education component for applicants, so that we're prepared to immediately evaluate and then educate and assist applicants to understand, number one, if their project will be submitted to this, and what that process will be for them. I guess, see where I'm going with this, Ms. DeBusk, is I'd rather us, and this is an underlying thought, I'll just share it kind of on the flip side of the question, companion to the question, is I want us to be prepared to proactively educate and assist applicants in smoothly going through this process as best as possible, as opposed to assuming that it's going to be a rare occasion that we will have an applicant project come through that where this needs to be applied. And you see where I'm going with the assume that a project will come in versus not assuming, and then the preparation and being poised to assist applicants with that kind of assumption.
Yes, Chair Schwartz, we would be ready to provide that level of information for applicants, absolutely.
Okay, is that something that you're working on now, that staff is currently engaged in, or will be shortly after July 1, I suppose?
Right, and I think once we have thresholds that are unique to the city, I think that will also be a different perspective at that point. But yes, at this point, we're using our letters to applicants as the way to inform them of the process.
Okay, thank you. And then this probably is back to either Ms. Peugeot or Mr. Dayton. And maybe this was answered in a different way to another commissioner's question. I read that there are, I guess I would call it 4 categories of decision-making that a local agency needs to make to implement these new guidelines. One is VMT metric, one is VMT methodology, one is VMT impact significance threshold, and another is VMT mitigation options. How does this fold into, if it does, any of the other answers you've given about the modeling, the timing, applicability? I'm just trying to perform triage in a way on all the information you've provided, Mr. Dayton, and then my supplemental reading as well. And not being an expert in this, I'm looking to the expert to help me navigate the understanding.
Well, Chair Schwartz, Ms. Peugeot might have more on this. What I would just say is that the particular categories you mentioned about mitigation and how would you solve if someone had an impact and that sort of thing is something that we would hope to have developed in the climate action plan along with the threshold and really establish more details for this. So we're really looking on people like Ms. Peugeot and Mr. Bolton to get us there. So anything to add on that, Ms. Peugeot?
Yes, Chair Schwartz. In the interim, we would be looking to the state guidelines on how to analyze VMT impacts and the type of project that it is, whether it's a transportation project, whether it's a large retail project or housing project, may affect which metrics we would want to use and which threshold may be appropriate to use. It's not necessarily a one size fits all, and that's consistent with the guidance. For example, OPR states that for large commercial projects, the threshold that's in the guidelines, and this is acceptable to use in the interim, but the city can certainly modify and tailor the thresholds, is a 15% reduction from existing VMT. And the thresholds for transportation projects are quite different. For that, the methodology and the threshold be looking, does it add vehicle lanes? Does it add capacity that would facilitate a greater vehicle miles traveled? So I think at this point, it would be on a case-by-case basis. If a project were to come along and trigger a VMT analysis that can't be screened out through being within the transit priority area, where we would look at appropriate metrics and thresholds to use. That's until the city thresholds can be identified through the climate action plan process.
And I heard Ms. Peugeot, or I thought I did from Mr. Bolton, looking at an end of year 2021, so end of next calendar year roughly, to be bringing forward amendments to the climate action plan, incorporating all that's required under Senate Bill 743 and the implementation measures. I'm just hoping that I'll just leave this with staff, certainly, that if we have projects coming in before then that trigger any of this, we figure out some interim tools that fall within our legal compliance requirements. And yet, if we're not fully prepared through a modified or amended climate action plan nonetheless. So sort of a short-term and longer-term strategy, and I can discuss that with staff another day, but I'm thinking of a parallel issue that I don't want to get into today because it's not agendized, where we may assume that we're not going to need to apply it, and we give ourselves, let's say in this case, a year and a half, but lo and behold, a project comes in, we need the tools to apply it, we don't yet have the tools, what do we do? So I'm sure you're already discussing that. I know that staff is very forward thinking in transportation planning. So again, I'll look forward to perhaps discussing that with you another time. Thank you so much. So those are my questions. I'll come back to the other commissioners. Anyone like to start with comments as we move to wrapping up this item? Just come back online and let's get into comments. Commissioner Wiscombe, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to keep my comments short. I think that I have to commend staff, all the staff that worked on this, and Mr. Dayton. The staff report was very clear. The exhibits are very clear, and my only comment about the traffic management strategy revisions relates to page 3, where you identify items on a list with asterisks. And it took me having to jump ahead and find out what those asterisks meant, which is information on page 4. So I think it would be helpful to just have a little footnote under where you have the asterisks to refer someone to page 4 or whatever. I think that this is going to hopefully result in a faster and more reliable determinations, which is great. I appreciated on page 8 of the traffic management strategy that you talked about all projects must be consistent with city's Vision Zero strategy. I think that's very important. And I can certainly support the recommendations, both A and B, that are on page 2 of our staff report. I think you did a marvelous job. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Other comments from commissioners? Now's the time for any deliberations, any thoughts that were not expressed in the question period. Don't be shy, don't hold back. Mr. Dayton is very eager to hear your thoughts. I know he is. He told me as much. I know you know how to use the webcams. Very eager. He's very eager to hear from us today. Don't leave me alone up here in the webcam world with. Okay. Oh, thank you, Commissioner Higgins.
You got one on the line.
See, there we go. I went fishing.
You really had to beat me on that. So it just doesn't go far enough.
Say more.
So you are. It feels like we're inching around on this conversation, and I can't decide. I have to be honest. I can't decide if I wanted to do more regionally. And, with Santa Barbara style, we do our own thing and we kind of just, put our head in the sand, quite frankly. And we're not doing enough to cooperate here regionally to make, a bigger impact. So I keeping the LOS as part of the routine, I understand that, but that seems disingenuous on a regional level. So I'm kind of torn. I got to be honest with you. You have any reaction to
that? Madam Chair and Commissioner Higgins. So help me understand. Are you talking about the congestion side? I think you're talking about the congestion side, not the VMT side of things. You speaking to the traffic management?
I'm talking about both. We're not out there I think, far enough with the actual VMT, calculators and tools that would, really have build a regional bridge to some of our other communities in this county that are part of the math and part of the analysis tools, right? I mean, or isn't that part of like a phase 2 or phase 3?
Well, so the way I would answer it is kind of go back to the intention of the legislation, which again is aimed at these bigger cities. But as it relates to the region, when you talk about that and you ask that question, what I think about is the South Coast consistent with Santa Barbara planning as a region? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
So yeah, okay. So and I would say no. I would say flat out no. I as a person who participated extensively and participates on the sub-regional committee of the SBCAG board and on the technical advisory committee, when we walked through the whole freeway, these were the questions. And if we were having that discussion again today and we weren't actually, building it as we progress up the coast, we're building it. And as a matter of fact, we're about to submit a grant for SB1 monies for the final phase. So if we get that grant will have all the money for the project. But if we were talking about it today and the issue is housing, it's funny that it's the same planning issue today as it is with the freeway. It's housing. The reason the freeway is being built is for housing. What we're talking about today is the lack of housing. So if I were king and the benevolent dictator, hopefully, what I would have done is I'd say, okay, you gave me $150 million seed money to build a freeway. Now I'm going to work with Gavin Newsom and Scott Wiener in the state legislature, and I'm going to make sure that $150 million goes to a significant amount of housing in the right place in Santa Barbara. And what I'm calling now the SB ecosystem. We have a downtown that we're trying to reinvent. We have beautiful buildings that are iconic to Santa Barbara. It's a global brand that we've developed. Everyone loves the city that we've created, but the ecosystem within that shell is not quite the environmental movement, the luster that we would like in terms of a live, work, play environment. And the earthquake that hit us that created the first iconic global brand, which is Spanish Revival architecture. Now we have a second earthquake. It's called COVID-19. And you had mentioned, the sagging of brick and mortar retail. We need to, at such a time as this, reinvent the downtown and create that ecosystem for downtown, which is a live, work, play. And we shouldn't be favoring people living in Oxnard or Camarillo or God forbid, Thousand Oaks or further south. I mean, that is not a good lifestyle for a human. And I think one of the things we're discovering with COVID-19 is, gosh, there's so much business. We don't even need to go there. We can do it from here. We're having a planning commission meeting and no one's in the room. You could be in Italy and Chair Schwartz could be in France and we could still have this meeting. So I think that I think your question and your comment is germane. And I would love to see congruent policy making and planning from a regional perspective. But first, I think that it's incumbent upon us as Santa Barbans to be congruent with our own planning policy and to be really convinced about climate change and what we can do to really follow along with the answers that will get us there, where we're living and working in the same place, and lead by example.
Can you hear me now?
We can, Commissioner Higgins, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, you guys were breaking up on my end, so I didn't catch quite the end of that, Rob. Last maybe 15 seconds.
I was just saying that it's incumbent upon us to really, one of the things I didn't get when I moved here as a traffic planner from Los Angeles is people would say, man, there's so much congestion. It's awful. And I was on the beach in volleyball, and someone said the party's out in Goleta, and someone else said way out there. I'm not going to that party. And I thought to myself, isn't Goleta like 15 minutes from here? They're like, yeah, it's so far. We would never drive out there. And it's like the stark contrast in those ideals. And then as I peel back the history, we walk through some of it in our presentation. And arguably creators of the environmental movement, we haven't always, as the Santa Barbara people, followed along with the ideals that we export to the world about strong environmental policy. And so I think we get there regionally by being really, really authentic with our Santa Barbara policies here and do them really well and be transparent about them. Because quite frankly, like price parking is a very difficult political decision, but it also makes things so much better. Not providing parking for housing is a very difficult decision, but it's designing for people and not vehicles. Holding congestion at its limits is a very difficult decision, but this is Santa Barbara. So those are some of the things that I would say in answer to your comment.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Higgins. I'm really glad you teed that up, and I think that'll provide stimulus for hopefully further discussion, further dialogue with our transportation planning staff, and maybe in some other framework or context, Mr. Dayton. Commissioner Bonderson, your thoughts for deliberation and comments?
Yes, thank you so much, Chair Schwartz. I have a few thoughts I just wanted to share, and basically the way I feel about what I've reviewed and after hearing the presentation and so on. I wanted to just express that I feel in favor of this entire discussion and decision, the process that has been presented, the exhibits that have been included, simply because this policy and its updated amendments support and implement the city's policy for limited incremental growth in general, in order to minimize the traffic impacts, and we can't use the word impact anymore, on our roadways, and while it clearly sets the stage to support downtown development. So for that reason, I find it to be a positive, we're moving in a positive direction. We're setting the groundwork for the direction we're moving towards as a whole, looking at all different aspects of what we need to be looking at as decision makers. I appreciate that it promotes the policy of focusing future development in the downtown area. I appreciate that the intention of the strategy is to minimize the expected traffic impacts while balancing the need for the economic development and establishing a much more simplified, more certain, and reduced cost development entitlement process. For me, that's really important when I look at all the materials as a whole, because what I found is that the process and its terms, its requirements, its exceptions, for me, they seem to be clearly defined in the materials. I did not struggle with understanding Exhibit A and Exhibit B in general, and the terminology that was used. So I strongly feel that an applicant or a public, a member of our public who's interested in developing their property would have hopefully a simpler and more clear experience, because this material that's been presented, these updates, the amendment, and so on that we're going to be voting on, really seem to support the pathway to project approval. That's at least the way I've interpreted what I've reviewed. And just like Chair Schwartz, I didn't just stop at the materials. I used several of the links. As I said before in my earlier comment, I appreciated all the references in the background because I used those to find more information. And I read Title 28 and I read Title 30 that was referenced, and I understood I spend quite a bit of time trying to understand the non-residential growth policies and so on to really be able to apply this information. I also would like to say that with regard to Exhibit B, and I'm going to quote something that I referenced when I took that information and went into some of the websites and the state mandates, is that I appreciate it because it, I quote, promotes the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the development of multimodal transportation networks, and a diversity of land uses. And I really think that that is something that we in Santa Barbara are unique about, and it's something that we as a city want to work towards. We want to develop the possibilities to have all the different areas function together. And I think that this is really setting the groundwork to do that. I found the whole entire experience of this to be very positive. That's what the comment I wanted to share.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. Mr. Dayton, I didn't hear any commissioners either ask questions or comment on Exhibit C, which is the draft resolution. So I'm just assuming that there are no suggested changes there. So unless there are other commissioners who have further comments, and I'm going to pause for a moment. Yes, Commissioner Bonderson, did you have?
If I may, I'll just continue. I didn't reference Exhibit C, but since you brought it up, I'm happy to do so. I went through it multiple times, and actually I spent a bit of my own personal attention using it to go back and look at the previous exhibits and really understand what each whereas comment implied, where it was coming from and what it entailed. I felt that it was extremely complete. I don't know if my fellow commissioners might find something else that should be added, but for my review, I felt that it really connected to the information and materials that were provided and supported those. My only question, and it's a question, it's not, there's no intention behind it other than just asking, a question about timing. Is timing an issue for this? Are we looking to set goals on what Mr. Dayton, for example, I'm going to address you directly. Based on what you presented to us, based on the goals that you've set, and ultimately what we talked about earlier about having measurements, tangible data that we can measure from, are there any timelines that we want to apply to help projects and assessment points for this strategy to make sure that it's working, and whether or not we want to have a timeline where we can come back, stop a moment, check everything, make sure we're on the right track?
Mr. Dayton,
you might believe would belong here.
Any thoughts, Mr. Dayton, as we can wrap up?
Yeah, Chair Schwartz and Commissioner Bonderson, I think the success is seeing the housing go in downtown. This is all about, planning is by metrics and process is all fine and dandy, but I can see from my window, I can see one of the projects going up on De La Guerra, and I'm delightfully disrupted as I walked up the street with concrete mixers and timber being delivered. Seeing that Santa Barbara ecosystem of a living population downtown go in, that is the true metric of our planning. And so I'm hoping to see that fruit. And then when we get to the modeling effort, we'll be able to disclose some of those milestones in terms of how we're doing in congestion, and hopefully be able to tell you a little bit more accurately what will happen when the freeway is completed.
Thank
Wonderful.
you, Mr. Dayton. Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. I don't have any additional comments myself. I've already complimented Mr. Dayton and the staff. And without further ado, if there's a commissioner or two who would like to make a motion. Again, we're looking at page 2 of our staff report. We have 2 recommendations to council to make. Commissioner Wiscombe, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will move recommendations A and B, which are clearly stated on page 2 at the top of our staff report.
Is there a second to Commissioner Wiscombe's making of that motion?
Thank you, Chair Schwartz. I do second Vice Chair Wiscombe's.
Very good. Commissioner Bonderson is seconding the motion. And so with that, I'm going to ask Ms. Rydell, if she's still with us, for a voice vote. And I will turn my webcam off. Mr. Dayton, if you would do likewise, we can have the other commissioners come on, please.
Thank you, Chair Schwartz. This is Heidi Rydell. I will take the roll call vote now. Chair Schwartz?
Aye.
Vice Chair Wiscombe?
Yes.
Commissioner Bonderson?
Yes.
Commissioner Escobedo?
Yes.
Commissioner Higgins?
Yes.
Commissioner Lodge?
Yes.
Commissioner Reed?
Yes.
Thank you so much. The motion was passed unanimously.
Very good, Ms. Rydell, and thanks to the commissioners for that. Now we go to our administrative agenda, and here we're going to receive any reports on committee and liaison activities. Staff hearing officer report. Commissioner Higgins, did you have anything for us today?
Commissioner Higgins, you're still muted, or now you're not.
Sorry about that. Nothing to report. There were no hearings in between today and last time we talked.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to other committee and liaison reports. Do we have anything else? Commissioner Wiscombe, you're back with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hope I can make this brief. Water Commission had a special meeting today. It was a 3-hour meeting. There was lots of things covered. So I'm just going to go over a couple of the administrative items, if I may. There was a report on water and wastewater rates and some recommendations made. The commercial sector was originally estimated, the revenues were originally estimated to drop about 70 to 90%, and staff has now revised that to around 50%, which is basically $350,000 a month for water and $150,000 a month for wastewater. So they view that there's going to be a gradual recovery in commercial. So staff is recommending a 3% increase starting not in FY 21, which would be July 1st, but in January 2021 for water rates. This is contrary to what the consultant had provided pre-COVID-19 of a 6% increase. So they think it provides rate relief, minimizes capital cuts, and also stabilizes reserves. So, and for wastewater, there's already been a 5% increase approved for FY 2021. So they're recommending that be taken forward too. And the total impact of it is basically a 4.4% average increase for water, wastewater, and solid waste for single-family residences, which results in basically a little bit less than $10 a month. Then they had a very engaged and informing discussion on a grant funding, a $10 million grant for the desal plant from Department of Water Resources. And the grant is intended to improve the state water supply infrastructure. So it's a regional grant, and it must be used for desal water for 36 to 40 years. So this was a very informed discussion. It was a very engaged discussion. They basically voted 3-1 to move it forward to City Council. And Commissioner Davis dissented on that. And then we had a water supply update. Let me just go to my notes here. Demand has been basically tracking goals for conservation, and water supply looks good. No shortage projected through 2022, which is great news. And we have no need to use groundwater at this point. And then finally, the last thing I want to report on is the Montecito Water District Water Supply Agreement status update, which was given today. So there's going to be a draft water supply agreement between the Montecito Water District and the city of Santa Barbara, released tomorrow, which would indicate delivery to the Montecito Water District of desal water beginning January 1st, 2022. There's also been a $1 million grant awarded for the project because it's regional. And in other words, regional means we're sharing water, it's economy of scale, we're sharing risk, and we're improving water quality. So it's very engaging discussions, and very brief recap of that, but it was quite an interesting meeting. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Commissioner Wiscombe. Any other reports? I was going to ask Commissioner Escobedo, could you remind us when your first Water Vision stakeholder group session is that coming up soon?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for reminding me. We had our first Water Vision Santa Barbara meeting last Thursday, where we got kind of the background of the diverse water sources that we have here in Santa Barbara, and then kind of opened up a discussion just talking about what groups were a part of this working group and then which ones we might want to invite. But that was just basically the basis for our next conversation that's going to take place next Thursday.
Very good. Thank you so much. Any other reports? Thank you. Any other liaison reports or any other committee reports? Okay, I will just mention, because I have been asked by some members of the public about the status of the Olive Mill Road, Coast Village Road roundabout project. This is in conjunction with the larger Highway 101 HOV mainline project. And Commissioner Higgins and I are co-liaison on this and the parallel projects. And in this particular case, Olive Mill, Coast Village Road. From our most recent communication with staff, and perhaps this is a part of a recap, early April, the application was deemed complete by the applicants, and this is a city-county project. Environmental review is underway, and we're waiting to hear back from planner Megan Arciniega on the status of that. Perhaps while we've been having our hearing today, she has sent us an email update. And then ultimately, perhaps in the next couple of months, there will be a joint City Planning Commission, Montecito Planning Commission hearing, details to be worked out, but that is where we're headed with this project. And I know that many are looking forward to that. That concludes our administrative agenda. And before I adjourn, just as a look ahead, June 4th, the Planning Commission has a very significant hearing, a single item, so to speak, and that is the average unit size density incentive program downtown focused package of amendments. That is the one and only item we're going to take up. It is requiring currently significant preparation by the commission, and I certainly will continue to work with staff on preparation for that. This is, I think there's a great deal of anticipatory excitement about bringing these downtown specific components to the AUD amendments forward at this time. And we'll just look forward to that being our next hearing again, Thursday, June 4th. So unless staff has any concluding remarks, and I'll wait a minute to see if Mr. Busk or any of the other staff members want to come back on. And if I don't see anybody, I'm ready to adjourn the meeting. I'll wait a moment though. Okay, I don't see any staff members coming back online. So with that, thanks to everyone. I would like the commissioners to please come back online. This is my best way and my only way to create in a simulated form that we're all together and all in this together. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. Thanks to everybody. And our hearing is now adjourned. So good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.